moderating the session. I take it that you are here because you understand the singular importance of these two issues, whether you're working on restoring degraded landscapes or trying to preserve the value in more pristine landscapes. We understand that we will start by asking two foundational questions. How strong are the tenure and other rights for the local people in that area? And how strong, if they exist at all, are the rights, especially for women amongst those local people? Two separate issues that come together. I'm delighted to welcome most of our panel for you, and it's a very strong one, which can only be augmented by our missing two, but a strong one without them. Oh, forgive me. Forgive me. Now, I can repeat any of that again. Can you hear me now? I can repeat any of that again, but did anybody miss anything particular? No, I'm sure you didn't. So let me introduce our panel. Ruth, Mines and Dick, immediately to my left, who's from the International Food Policy and Research Institute. We're missing Esther Mwara-Wiru from Group Grassroots Organisation in Kenya. She may join us later. Joan Kagwanja is from the Land Policy Initiative of the African Union. Sorry, Joanne, spelled Joan. And to her left, Inga Anderson, who's the boss of IUCN. And to her left, we're hoping to see Andrea Ledwood, who's the head of Climate and Environment at DFID. And then at the end, representing men on this panel, Hardy Daryanto, who's also, he wears two hats, the DG of Social Forestry at the Ministry of Forests in Indonesia. So, we had one other funky question for you, but I think the man that was going to ask it may be looking for our missing panelists. Let me try. Can you hear me through this mic as well? Yeah. So the funky question is this, if I can get there. Yeah. How much of the land in developing countries do women own? We just want a quick check of your state of knowledge. Okay, there's your choice. How much of the land in developing countries do women own? A, less than 1%, B, 2 to 5%, C, 10%, or D, I don't know. Okay, now show of hands. Who thinks that the answer to that question, how much of the land in developing countries do women own, is A? Strong minority. B, similar. C, okay, optimists there. D, okay, Hardy?
Less than 1%.
Less than 1%. Rest of the panel? 2 to 5. Joanne? Ruth?
I'm going with Joanne.
Okay, so the answer is D. We just do not know. So we're at the bottom of the hill with a distance to climb. Ruth is going to help us do that with a bit of a tour d'horizon of the state of knowledge. Ruth, do you want to come and crack on with that? I think if I take you to there.
Yeah, let's see. Yes. Yes, okay. As the researcher, it's with some trepidation that I get up here having said, I go with D, I don't know. But honestly, that's the state of the knowledge. I will try to tell you, as a researcher who tries to advocate for evidence-based policy, I will try to tell you what we do know. First of all, women and men are partners in sustainability. I do not come to you saying that women are the inherent keepers of the earth. We've looked at the evidence on that, and it's mixed. What we come to is that neither women nor men alone are going to be the keepers of the earth. They need to be partners in this. but it's not an equal partnership right now. There's a lot of resources that are needed to be able to address land degradation. But one of the really important ones that's a theme of this Global Landscapes Forum is tenure. And we do know that in both sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, from the few nationally representative data sets that are available, the evidence is that women own less land and have less secure tenure than men. And I'm going to draw on a couple of studies by colleagues for that. And that when they do have claims to land, or claims of even ownership, under customary law, their documented rights are much weaker. So this is from the demographic and health surveys. If you ask men and women independently, do you have sole ownership of land? You see that the yellow lines for women are much lower than the blue lines for men. The gray lines are at the household level. If you include joint ownership, the picture gets a lot more equal. So do you own land jointly with somebody? Then it comes up a lot more equal. And, by the way, almost all of these numbers are more than the 1%. Now, when you say this is self-reported ownership, if you actually look at documentation of that, you see that for women, men, and joint, the documented ownership is much less than the undocumented claims of ownership, and that women have less than men or joint. This is from Uganda. If you look across the countries for which we have nationally representative data in sub-Saharan Africa, you get that same picture with a couple of notable exceptions. Malawi, you've got very strong undocumented claims for women's land rights. Malawi is a country with a lot of matrilineal inheritance. The other notable case here is Ethiopia, where women still have less than joint or men's, but all of that is documented. And I'll come back to that in a minute, because in Ethiopia, land registration really has been done in a manner that strengthens women's land rights. Not only leaving a space for putting women's names on it, but in some areas also putting their photos on the land registration certificates. Turning to Asia, you actually see much less joint ownership, and both the incidence of ownership, that is the proportion of women who claim having any ownership of land, as well as the share of landowners and the share of the area, is much lower. Still not 1%, but this is for Bangladesh, Tajikistan, Timor-Leste, and Vietnam. Here you see a little bit more equality. Again, Vietnam has had a gender-sensitive land certification program. Similarly, if you look at joint ownership, it does improve in most of the countries that we have this available from the demographic and health surveys. Why does it matter? Especially, it matters for a lot of reasons, but one that we're focusing on today is why women's land rights matter for land restoration. We have evidence that when women have stronger land rights, and they know about that, they are more likely to make investments in land restoration. So in Ghana, we have evidence that women with less secure tenure are less likely to leave land fallow, which is necessary for land regeneration in these agricultural systems. Women with more secure tenure are more likely to plant trees. In Ghana, similarly in Ethiopia, and in Ethiopia there's other climate-smart agriculture practices that women with more secure tenure are likely to adopt. And that is, they need to not just have the rights, but they need to know about the rights. And I'm jumping ahead to some of the points that I hope the we'll get to later. But thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ruth. I think that was a great express tour around the state of knowledge. So, Esther, we welcome.
Thank you.
We think this is important. We know something we don't know as much as we'd like to know. Can you sort of take us a bit closer to the ground in Kenya?
Thank you very much.
And tell us why it's important that women have, I'll call you, have decent land tenure rights.
Is it okay? Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry that I came late. I had a privilege to go to City Hall and meet the Mayor of Paris, and it took 40 minutes to start the meeting. I'm so sorry for that. So I'm sorry for that.
No. We're fine.
But I'm grateful. And my name is Esther Mwaura Moiro. I come from Kenya. And for the last 20 years, the only thing I've done as a social planner is working with grassroots women who live in poverty. Women who many of us often think that what they require is charity to survive. And often when we design programs and we design projects, we count them as targets for our own work. And within my own years of work, it has proved actually they are not. And most often they have solutions to what needs to be done, and we only need to be a little patient and give them the opportunity. And there is not many areas that you can prove that than when you want to speak to effective utilization of land, how to make land more functional, how to make land produce much more than it can. When we are talking in this space, we've been hearing about all the impact of climate change, and many farmers will tell you that production has gone down because of all the impacts. And so when we're talking about restoration of land, then it's very necessary that we bring people who have those solutions. And just like Ruth said, women will not invest in land that they don't consider that tomorrow they will have an opportunity to utilize. So having control of land and knowing that they can maintain that control over time is very important. The grassroots women that we work with, first, land is an identity, is a self-identity for them. That is the space that they consider, this is where I come from. Many of us who even go to live in the cities, every year we go back home. And we do not stay in Christmas in the cities. We go back to our rural areas. That is our identity. Many of the places that the women I work with, the only livelihood they get is working in those farms. So for them to restore land and to have it more productive is really a huge benefit. But what did we realize many years back? We realized that many of the legal frameworks, the policies that have been generated over years, did not have the experience of women in mind. In 2004, we realized that the women who had used that land for a long time, just because their spouses had died of HIV and AIDS, they were considered that they are the one who had brought this HIV. They were thrown out of their matrimonial homes. And many of them came to us and told us, you know, it looks such a big thing. And every time we go to communicate to the government, nobody tells the statistics of how big this is. And the women took upon themselves to go and actually account on the magnitude and the extent of the asset stripping that was happening. And that was the point that the government realized, actually, widows' disinheritance, orphan disinheritance was a huge magnitude. And it had impacted the contribution of the food basket at the household level. And I remember negotiating with a huge number of women with the then Minister of Land and saying, can we just have something that talks about widows and orphans in the national land policy. And it actually got there. We have a sentence that says that when we talk about access and land ownership, widows and orphans have to be taken care of. We never stopped there because we realized that actually a policy by itself may not contribute to any practical solution for the women. So we worked with many of the other actors, the National Land Commission, the National AIDS, the NAC, the National AIDS Control Council, that then had the mandate to respond to HIV, and we had developed this model of women who were protecting land disinheritance. They were called the community land watchdog groups. Today, they're actually in 8 countries in Africa. We developed them in Kenya, but the model has been replicated in 8 countries in Africa, where the women are actually not only waiting for people to protect their land rights, they're not only waiting for the legal framework and the lawyers to come and protect them, but they have actually started to watch and realized that they can become part of providing the solution. The other thing we realized that there are many people, women, who are moving away, looking for other places to stay because services are not available in the areas that they live. And for many people who do not have resources, or they have, they do not have money to pay for private services, they rely on public services. Then we saw this whole link between public land and private land. And most people asked us, why would public land matter in the lives of the women? But we realized that was the problem in Kenya. Everybody called public land government land. And we asked women, what is actually this government land? And they went back to their community, and we supported them to do a whole investigation on what does government land mean and what does private land mean. They actually realized from their their own family lineage that actually what we consider to be public land was land that was given by each family. They contributed a piece of their land, so that land would be set aside to provide for things like school, hospital, cemetery, and all those kind of things. But what has happened over years, because we've called it public government land, all the people who have had power in our country have been able to use that land for their own personal use, because it's government land. Nobody cares about it. It's government land. Nobody cares to manage. And when we were writing the national land policy, we also were very conscious, and we made our government to actually appreciate they did not have an inventory of public land. And that is why it was difficult to manage in public land. And so more recently, we've supported grassroots women in our community to do a participatory model on how to develop a public land in their community. And we are glad to say that the current National Land Commission that was put in place only 2 years ago has considered this to be the framework that we'll use. Now, what is happening in this? What is the link between the land that women use for their livelihood and the land now that they can safeguard and secure our public spaces? Now, women, when we have been able to support certain communities to safeguard their rights to private land, they are able to use that and increase their productivity. I can tell you with the World Bank project that we are recently implementing, with funding from the Japan government, we were privileged to have a $3 million grant from Japan government. And what we were told is to demonstrate that if you invest in the households who are living in poverty and put this money in the hands of the women to increase productivity in their farms, you are going to bridge gender inequality. So we have to show that. But we realized if the women are not accessing public service and they are taking 5 kilometers to go to the hospital, or they are taking 10 kilometers to go to look for another service, then the time labor that they have to spend on the land is not useful. So making a link with this, all this kind of land, and making sure that actually the women can also utilize land account. And this is another point that we have also realized. Women making a track record of what kind of investment they are making on that land. It's not just about celebrating that women are increasing the amount of livelihood in the family, but it's helping women to put a record of that. And making sure that when the husbands are in the home, they can negotiate with them and show, this is how much school fees I have paid, this is how much hospital bills I've been able to pay, this is my contribution to this to livelihood. And what we've realized is that it has actually made sure when women have been able to utilize land properly, they first of all negotiated for joint titling when it's possible, and even when it's not necessary to have joint titling, to have control on when to use the land, to use the land for, and actually to have the role to say, even when we die as a couple, who will get our inheritance right? We've seen in the last 3 years that the women have now been able to even interpret that in how do we give our land when we die to both our girls and boys, because I can show as a mother how much effort I'm making. In this project we've been able to say, because women have been able to put so much effort in their land, in their land, and because they have control, we've seen women who would only earn like 1,700 shillings, which is about $20, they have been able to increase productivity by supplying 4 to 5 tons, for example, potatoes, and they are able to get $1,500 per month for the household. Once they've been able to track that, they are able either to buy more land, make use of the land, maybe utilize land that was already lying fallow, and increase to the productivity not only in the household but at the community level.
Okay, thanks. That's terrific. That did take us close to the ground. I think we got a great kind of summary from Kenya of why, if you want people to look after land, manage it well, and also enrich themselves, they need to have a long-term ownership stake, and just quite how difficult it is to ensure that in so many countries. I think what you got onto towards the end, why it's especially important and even more difficult to ensure those rights for women. I'd like to hear a bit more about that. I mean, as sort of idle journalists sort of drifting around developing countries, it is obvious to us that women do a lot or most of the work in Africa, developing countries more broadly, don't have ownership rights, certainly, and spend a lot less time drinking beer and more time looking after children when they're not working. So it sort of seems obvious that if women have more of an ownership stake, the family will benefit. But I know that that's not always true. So I would like to know why my sort of general apprehension is accurate to a degree, and why it's a bit more complicated than that. And I'd like the rest of our panelists to sort of take that on a little bit. Juan Darianto may or may not take that on, but anyway, I'm going to call on him next because he is chickening out of this women-heavy panel and is going to leave a little early. Hardy.
Yes, thank you. In Indonesia, about land tenure, we have 2 laws. Is according the colonization era. The first for the ownership, land ownership is based on the agrarian laws. And then if we link to the forest land as state land, there are the other law, what we call forestry laws. In the agrarian lands laws, it is possible for ownership, you can sell, what you do. Then if the land destroyed, government cannot intervene. And on the other hand, for the forest land, the people or the citizen can use utilization right. If the land degraded, then the government can rehabilitate even restore. Now, according to the woman ownership in Indonesia, one tribe in West Sumatra, we call Nagari, it is a matriarchat laws. The land is owned by the woman. In Indonesia language, woman is perempuan. Perempuan is mean empu, is owned. So, by the historical, land is owned by the woman. But the legal basic legal, as we saw in the report of the Madam Ingrid Anderson in Indonesia, mostly land title is owned by the man. Honestly speaking, in terms of today with the President Jokowi, because inequality is in the land ownership is so high in Indonesia. Now we introduce for the social forestry. We learned from Hernando de Soto from Peru, who was in Indonesia 2006, and also from Gramin Bank Muhammad Yunus. The government introduced the government regulation number 6. It is possible for the land owned by the state to be used right by the people. Of course, the specialty for the poor who live surround or close to the forest. In my cases, when we learn from Gramin Bank, with Sri Mulyani, in IMF, we introduced for revolving fund, and it is specialty for a woman who manages the state land forest. It can be revolving fund, and the title, of course, linked to the. I mean, linked to the citizen who want to manage the forest land. For example, for the community rights, what Indonesia speaking indigenous community customary right, it's a community, not owned by the individual, but the title for plantation, a small scale plantation, can be used, right, can be owned by the, or not owned, can be managed by the individual. It's also included for the woman. So it is what I can share with you. Of course, inequality, it look like same with the Kenya. It's owned by the state, was by the Governor General Raffles in the war with the Napoleon, because they need the tax. So it is easy to control. And the king and sultan in Java, they have to control the land. And the Dutch, the colony, they can collect the tax. But for the people who live in the coastal, sometimes sultan, then the king and sultan, it cannot control because the resources can be moved every corner of the island of the Indonesia. So you can see, it's not so easy to answer if why the woman or why inequality the land ownership in Indonesia, especially for women or men. This from myself.
Okay, thank you. I'd just like to ask you one quick question. You can answer it briefly, because I want to make sure that I understood what I thought was a strong takeaway from your remarks. Did you mean, in your bit of semantics, that traditionally women did own land, or that they should own land? So is it that the modern Indonesian state has taken away those rights, or did they actually never have those rights?
But it is just not all the Indonesia, there's just a specialty in West Sumatra. Semantic perempuan came from the Malay language, and empu is on. It happened in only in West Sumatra. Then Nagari is not very
It
popular.
definitely means owned, not owned.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. The other, for Bali, for the Balinese, the woman who walk strongly, then the let's say the what would call it, the gentleman or the man, they walk for another way.
Okay.
So,
All right.
it is.
Got that. Thanks very much. We should thank Hardy Daryanti, ladies and gentlemen, who has to leave a little early.
Yeah.
Thank you, Hardy.
translate in other.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So, Joanne, this is about our horizon covers developing countries, but almost all of the countries that Ruth mentioned in her opening remarks were African ones. Can you give us a bit of a continental perspective? I know you're going to say something, you want to say what you're doing, and we can get to that. I want to know why it's important. I need to understand more why this should be a priority for us when there are so many competing demands.
Thank you, James. I think three simple messages. One, it does not make economic sense to exclude women from controlling land. We cannot, I remember when President Obama came and spoke to the African Union, he said he does not understand how you can leave 50% of your team and expect to win. And we can't do that. So it does not make economic sense. And what Ruth showed is that you cannot exclude your rural producers, most of whom are women, and expect to produce food and expect to grow these economies in Africa. The second one is that it's undemocratic. And we say that lightly, but it's not light because we've made commitments. And I'm not talking about Africa alone, I'm talking about the world. We've made commitments about human rights, about women's rights. It's in our declarations, it's in our charters, and it's not democratic. But even as we say these things, we must realize that it's very complex. We don't want to trivialize it. Because in some instances in Africa, you could actually go full force and say, oh, it's in our constitution and you have to enforce it, and force people to do that. And when you go back home, you will not you will not be able to sleep at night. And you will be ostracized from your communities for the mere fact that you own land. So we must realize the spaces through which this is being enforced are spaces which are very, very complex, and that it may not be legitimate for women to own land, even as it is, it's legal in the legal sense of the write-up. So it's important for us working at the continental level then to examine the issues and say, so what are we supposed to do? I mean, we have an African agenda right now, which is Agenda 2063, which talks to issues of equality, issues of economic, transforming our economies, and we cannot do that without women's land rights. And that's why it's important to us. But that is underpinned by policy, it's underpinned by good governance, it's underpinned by the partnerships that you hold and good research and good evidence in order for us to be able to convince the permanent secretary or the traditional chief who says, show me why it's important for me. I gave the land to the household. What is the issue here? Because of those inter-household issues, and those come out of research, but also the need to build our capacities. But James, I wanted to say, the commitments that have to be made are actually not easy to reach. And in October, we just got a commitment from the continent that commits us to allocating 30% of the land by 2025, or to document that the land that is owned by anyone, 30% of it is in the hands of women. And that sounds light, but when you saw the data that we were looking at, and you see most people thinking it's 1%, it's because it's not documented. In many countries, even Malawi, where we have probably a 30% ownership of land, probably only about 5% of that is documented. And this is for men and women, yes, but for women it's even worse, this Ruth was talking about. So the commitments that we make are really, really important in this regard.
Okay, thanks for that, Joanne. So I'm very struck by your example of the woman who has the temerity to possess strong land rights and is ostracized by her community. Perhaps that's a narrative that we could pursue a little further in this discussion. Inga and Andrea afterwards, that most of what Joanne is arguing for is actually, if I understand correctly, sort of gender non-specific land rights. Land tenure is very, very weak in developing countries, whether you're a man or a woman. I'd still like to know kind of what difference it makes whether a man or a woman has that tenure right. A lot of the literature seems to be addressed to the different outcomes that you might expect to get if women have decent land rights. Perhaps you could address that a little.
Well, yes, and first of all, brilliant interventions by the previous speakers, and very much to the core here. So, it's about power. And take that first day of the opening of the COP, and take away all the males in the heads of state, and you are left with Christian, Angela Merkel. You can count them on one hand. And we had the largest number of heads of state ever assembled under the roof. And yet, you see, so who brings that women's voice? Of course, there are very good men bringing that voice, but it is also, when you are in our gender, you also bring that voice because you carry it every day. And so, it is about power, and that's something that is quite important to understand. The INDCs that have been issued, how many of these speak to this, right? And what's actually interesting, when you read the INDCs, you will see that some of the countries that have been the most strident on gender issues in the South have not, and this is the first time that they are having to do something similar in the SDGs, have not actually written about this in their own countries. And I'm speaking about the OECD countries. Very interesting dynamics, because it's easy to preach, more difficult to do. And so the power story is one that I think we shouldn't lose. Now, we've heard from the previous speakers, it is about the law, it's about knowledge of the law, it's about education around the law, and it is about having gender sensitivity around, you know, those who actually take the decisions. Your question about, okay, so in Africa, for example, and we heard from the previous brilliant two speakers, 43% average of agricultural labor is female. In Nigeria, 1%. We know 1% of the land is owned by women. So what does that do? Well, women are logical too, right? We're not illogical beings. So, are you going to de-stone the field? Are you going to lay it fallow? Are you going to invest your muscle, your sweat, your blood and tears in this land that you don't know whether you will have the next year? Of course you're not. You wouldn't. No man would. So if you don't know that this is yours, what are you going to do?
What percentage of total land in Nigeria has got strong private
Of
land
course,
over it?
clearly there's a need for an overarching land reform in most of the countries. However, when we look at male-owned lands, I don't have the number on top of my head, it is much, much larger. I'm sure Ruth will have access to that knowledge and can reel it off. The story here is just that knowledge, as we heard from Esther, of the law is one thing. Even when you do own it, it can be socially quite detrimental to your standing. So there's so many aspects here. But we also know from research done by the World Bank, by IFAD, by others, that the moment that women do have access and legal rights, and the moment that half of your team is off the bench and on the team, you can see massive increases or decreases in malnourishment and significant increases in ag production. And that's at a time when we're faced with these four challenges. You know, we need to create greater resilience in a climate-changing world. Well, hey, it makes a great deal of sense to mobilize everybody in that regard. We still have, a billion people malnourished, and 1.3 billion living in extreme poverty. It might be smart to think about getting greater productivity on the land. We need to think about conservation. We're living in a time when we are losing species 1,000 times the natural extinction rates. Well, women are often much less a user of heavy chemicals, are often much more doing agronomy, and so are also many times, and in large part because of poverty and because of absence of ownership, I have to admit, but nevertheless, these are facts. So these elements
had they ownership and the same access to chemical fertilizers they would use.
Could certainly be. On the other hand, it's also a large degree a question of the kind of subsidies we put on the fertilizer load, who has access to credit, etc., which is often men. Could of course be, if you wave your magic wand, women are banked, have subsidies, have access, have rights, that one could pursue the same thing. That's why I go back to, it is a question of power. Who are the ministers of agriculture? What is the prevailing discourse within those communities? It is a male-dominated, and it is a company or large-scale agriculture, and it is a agriculture input type setting. And moreover, women are largely providing 90% of the nourishment in the home. So women are the caregivers in large part. Women would like to see children grow. Women would like to see children have healthy diets. And healthy diets come, yes, from grains, but certainly also from meat and vegetables, which often are part of what women grow in vegetable gardens, not necessarily the large, expansive fields that are often mechanized. So these dimensions of whole nourishment, better outcomes on climate and better outcome on species and conservation are actually very integrated right into the power structure that we see today. So legal issues matters, voice matters, and action matters, which is why the kind of things that we're hearing from my colleagues here on this panel is absolutely what it is about. These things won't turn over by themselves. They have to happen by example. And sometimes we need to push it to push it to the fore. There are some countries that have simply said, okay, we gotta have parity in parliament, we gotta have parity in certain settings, and that begin in our boardrooms, whatever it is. And I think that that is part and parcel of the conversation, because otherwise, where have we come in the last 30 years in gender empowerment? We've come a long way, but we have not come where we need to be. And we don't have 30 more years to wait on this, in large parts also because of the pressures that climate is putting on our production systems.
Okay, thanks for that, Ingrid. So, Andrea, we've heard academic intervention, activist, policy stroke government. From a sort of donor and policy making, I suppose, perspective, can you tell me, and I'd love it if you could give us the most concrete examples that you can, perhaps from Rwanda, where there's been very active on this, increasingly to Ethiopia. Why is this important? And if I may again just underline the point, from an equality perspective, from a democracy perspective, it is clear that women should have the same rights as men. I'm also interested in outcomes. What is the difference that you get when women have these rights?
So 20 years ago I lived in Ghana for about 8 months in the Upper Volta region, working with the government of Ghana to demarcate a new national park. So essentially I was asked to go and map women's access to resources in that national park and work out what the women needed as distinct from the men who'd already put the boundaries around the new national park, who'd already demarcated it and already agreed what the outcome should be. And after kind of 6-8 months of quite painstaking kind of ethnography and work with these communities, we essentially managed to redraw the boundaries quite significantly to encompass a number of villages and a number of very significant areas because they were the ones that the women needed access to. They were the areas where the women needed to go and access to the palm oil. They needed access to the particular firewood for their household cooking every day. And what was interesting was the men who had previously been involved in demarcating the park had never thought to ask the women. They'd never taken the time, they'd never had the inclination to hear their voices and therefore recognised that they had fundamentally different access needs and fundamentally different priorities for this whole new national park. So it can be very fundamental in terms of when you listen to women, you lead to a very concrete outcome that is very different from the one that would previously have been there. So I guess, I feel very strongly that actually you need very tangible outcomes. And I guess the 3 areas I think it's worth looking at. The first one is thinking about it at a societal level, and it's the point you made, which is that if you don't open up a kind of governance structure where you're listening to half of society and they're locked out, you're never going to have a strong and open society and an economy and very weak governance. So I think about the Green Climate Fund board, for example, where I sit on the board there, and we have less than 10% of the Green Climate Fund board and alternate members are women. So we have 4 out of 48 are women on that board at the moment. And it's, I don't know if any of you ever watched the Green Climate Fund board, it's one of the most dysfunctional governance structures I think I've ever seen in my life. It's quite a direct correlation. So that's the first governance issue. The second one then would be about the kind of deeply political...
I knew this was going to descend into wisecracking against men.
You asked me. The second one is then at a kind of household level in terms of assets and building resilience. I mean, it's fundamentally political. Who has access to the assets, who looks after the assets, and who makes choices about the use of them. And clearly, for many poor households, the land is the fundamental asset that they have. That's the thing that's 100% at stake every single year, according to the rains, according to the floods, according to the productivity. So of course then, transferring and kind of somehow making very tangible women's access to that is important, but on top of that, then you have to look at the quality of that. And I mean, we've already heard sometimes it's the quality of the tenure which is lower for women as well. So it's whether it's the poorer bit of the land, or it's the marginal land, or it's not all the resources on the land, it's maybe just the title itself. So there's, it's fundamentally about power at a household and a societal level. And then the third point, I think, is just that it's about economic development and transformation. Again, both for the individual to have an asset that they can use, that they can produce from, but also then at a broader kind of community and a societal level. So in Ethiopia a few years ago, when I ran DFID's aid programme out there, we had a lot of conversations with the mayor about a peri-urban development programme that was going on there, where they were essentially moving people within Addis Ababa, where they wanted to reconstruct and do a lot of development. But it was what was very interesting. It was often women who were running small businesses and women who were doing very key kind of community assets within those. It wasn't about just their households. It was about women using space in that peri-urban environment as productive assets. They were creating these spaces where you had schools, you had preschools, you had businesses. And so the knock-on impact then of reducing that and not giving the women the right to tenure and security of it has such a wider amplification then in terms of their economic power as an individual as well as in the wider community. So you wanted some concrete examples. So I guess I can give you four. So the first one would be about in Tanzania, where DFID is working closely with the government there on custody and social systems. So that's about reforming the legal framework, but also recognising that the legal framework isn't just what's written down in the law, in the parliament or in the centre. It's about deep societal change and kind of customary law in many cases, and that's a very painstaking process to really work
These,
with behaviour change.
just briefly, are these examples of what you're doing? Because we'll come back to that. I'd like an example, if you have one, to illustrate the point that you get a much better outcome.
Yeah. So that's the Tanzania example where we're working on those customary and social rules and norms. The second one then would be in Rwanda, I guess, with the land tenure regularisation programme, where it's a sensitisation programme. It's about understanding. So not only do you need the framework to be right, you then need an understanding and a sensitisation.
Let's come back to that
it.
because that's a slightly later part of this discussion. I'd like an example, if you have one, that nails the need, not the activity, not the response.
So I guess in Ethiopia, the example there of the LIFT program that I've got is basically, it's a government-led program that's at the heart of their economic development strategy, because they think by securing women's land tenure, they will increase the incomes by 20% of those individual women at the household level. So that's about a very clear economic driver, and it's about quantified changes to do with income level at a household level is one of the drivers, is the main driver there. So that's one of the concrete outcomes, I guess.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Here's a quick question for anybody on the panel. I just want to keep pressing you on why this is important, actually. I read some studies last night in Malawi where relatively strong land tenure rights for women had led not to more productive agriculture, but to less cash crops being grown on that land, and so less productive agriculture. Why might that be? Somebody, anybody? In other words, why is this more complicated than we might think it is at first glance?
I think it's because it's not just one thing, James. You have the land rights and control, but you also have, if you think of the factors of production, it's not just land in it. You have capital, and you have technology, and you have knowledge. And all of them, together with land rights, then would yield the productive outcome that you're seeking. And so we can't just decouple the solution. And we have failed sometimes in doing so, where we thought in South Africa, when we address historical injustice by providing land away from white farmers, or in Zimbabwe to black farmers, that you win the solutions that you seek. And then there was the economic outcome was not what we expected. And that's because we need a more comprehensive way of looking at things. So access to credit is not also just about securing land rights. I think Ruth would tell us that with the data. Is that it needs to be coupled with the institutions that do provide the credit that you seek, and within programs that are more up to smallholder farmers. So it's not your regular bank, you go and get your charge documents in that long process and get your loans. It's thinking about the smallholder farmer landscape and developing the tools or the products. Educating banks almost are using mobile technology to get M-Pesa if you need to, coupled with the access to credit and with the land rights, everything coming together, we will do that. And here we are also talking about, when we talk about climate change and adaptation and mitigation practices, we're looking at very capital intensive, some of them, or long-term application of manure and others to increase the biomass and carbon in the soil. And you're looking at these long-term, and that's why the security of tenure becomes important. So you can't also say, oh, security of tenure is not important, let's approach it from fertilizer or from manure or other areas. It's all together, and it all has to be looked at in a very integrated manner.
Okay, so Ingrid, come to you, but a question if you like. It's got to be part of an overarching development strategy. You can't push land tenure rights in isolation from education, access to credit, all these other things, and expect to get an improvement. So the question really is it therefore wrong to press land tenure rights for women if all those other things are going to take a long time, or if you don't have the capital, you don't have the political will, if you have less educated female population, for example?
The answer is no, but don't hold them accountable for not having improved their productivity. You can then look at what it has addressed in terms of empowerment and in terms of other areas. We cannot say, let's wait until everything is perfect. No, you have to start somewhere. But actually, most people tend to address those other issues faster than they address the issues of land tenure, because it's a lot more complex.
And you get perverse outcomes, such as that one in Malawi.
Absolutely.
Ruth, do you want to comment on that? Ingrid, then we'll come to you.
I realize this is turning the tables and I'm not supposed to ask the journalist the question, but I want to push you about, I don't know the particular study, but you said less cash cropping and therefore it's less productive. Now, that's two different things. It's not necessarily less productive because they're not marketing as much. In fact, it may be a matter of they have chosen to produce more to feed their families. It may be that they lack the transport to get it to market, or the biggie that we find all over the place is that once it's cash, the men take it to market, the men take the cash, the women lose control. So unless there are the M-Pesa payment, all of these other things so that women actually control the cash income, we find a lot of the cash, they've lost the control over it, so they may well be it could well be overall increasing productivity, increasing nutritional outcomes.
Sure, it could. I can't come back to you on that
So
specific
that's
example. I
not
don't know the local economy.
that's
well.
not necessarily a perverse outcome.
Not necessarily. No, not necessarily.
So.
Actually, I'm going to go to Inga because she
that
wanted
was
to make a comment earlier.
Well, that was exactly my point. I just thought we were making some assumptions from something. There was in the 60s and 70s this thought that, well, we just had to go into large-scale agriculture across Africa and across many other places because then we can sell this grain and that's all very good. But we're forgetting that that does not necessarily lift the poorest out of poverty, that large agglomerations may not necessarily, it transforms those who have been tilling the land into laborers and a day labor wage, but not necessarily the ability to sell the products that is generated. And women often are those who hold smallholder farms and are very difficult for them, obviously, to get into the large-scale farming. So there are many, many parameters that one needs to look at. And finally, of course, the nutrition aspect. Women will always try to, I think, when we talk about smallholders, to grow vegetables and other things that are immediately of use for family nutrition. So all of these things need to be looked at. So this entire panel will push quite a lot against this question, because it's the wrong question to ask at
Why?
this time. Because of all these other aspects that needs to be considered. Now, we don't actually know what study it is that you're looking at, but the point is that it is largely a function of those power relationships, and it's largely a function of understanding then those shifts that needs to happen. Land tenure is absolutely fundamental. These are the basic rights that anyone has.
We all agree that it's fundamental.
So,
but I want what I'm asking you to do is to explain. Asking why it's not a panacea necessarily.
Why?
I'm asking you to tell me why it's not a panacea, as we often hear that it is. land tenure rights have been extremely fashionable for a long time, and for women
It's
that
not
too.
a panacea in that any one issue is never a panacea. Me having the right to vote does not necessarily, in my country, does not necessarily mean that I have all the rights and that I'm represented in the manner that I would wish, or that the laws that are passed, etc., etc. So, but it is one of the key stepping stones towards women empowerment and towards more effective land use and higher productivity.
Okay, thank you for that. We are going to come to you, the audience, now. First of all, could you get your cards ready? I think somebody should be on hand to collect them from you and sift through them in the sort of half hour that we have left. And now that's in process, could I urge you to give us any questions or comments that you might have on what you've heard so far or on the topic? And I hope that we have a microphone. Do we have a microphone at hand? Yes, thank you. So there's a lady there and gentleman in the far corner. Do we just have one mic?
Can I just say something?
Yeah, Esther. Well, okay. If
Yeah,
it could be
because,
quite short, please.
Yeah. I think it should not be negotiable if women should access and control that. First and foremost, it's a right that has been denied. And I think before we do any other analysis, what is its economic gain? What is political gain? I think we need to first of all say it's a right that must be guaranteed.
I think you're preaching to the converted. I mean, I think that's understood.
I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't think so. Because you are not the only one who has that message. And
No, come on.
sorry,
I have no. We're going to move on because we're going to get started.
I
have no
from
message.
DFID
okay.
no, let me just say that. I heard from the DFID that the government are seeing it as an economic opportunity to provide that rights to women. It is very important. But I think that should not be the reason why government should be eager to give land rights to women. They must first of all see it as a right and then fulfill all the other things. Because women, we cannot be the vehicles for providing economic value for our country. We can justify that. I have justified that in the project we are doing. But I think fundamentally, the women's land rights is a right that I think all states must guarantee, and that all states must see it as the ultimate, which drives their way to reform land and do other things.
I wise words, well spoken. I would just point out that there are two parts to this conversation. One is about honouring a right, which I think we all recognise as being non-negotiable and fundamental, but also it's about the real world. This is a conference about landscapes. What is the effect on the real world when those rights are strengthened, which is a passage that we think we're all pushing along. Questions? Yes, lady there, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's a comment, Judith Kamoto from Malawi. I've heard a lot about Malawi being mentioned.
Are you from Malawi?
I am from Malawi, and we did a study for a USAID funded project called Protecting Ecosystems and Restoring Forests in Malawi, in short PERFORM, and it was a gender assessment study. And I hear a lot of assumptions that in countries like ours, where we have matriarchal society, it's believed that women have rights to land, but it's not the case. In our study, we found that it's just the same because we have two systems, patriarchal and matriarchal, and this project is in both areas, and in both sets of districts it's not the case. Women still don't have rights to land and decisions to plant trees and do other things like we are discussing now is still an issue. So sometimes it's when you hear about statistics in Malawi, you feel like, oh, I'm being misrepresented there, but this is the reality that women also need such rights. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you for that. It's still a big problem in Malawi then. Yes, gentleman at the back.
Thanks, James. Alan Nichol from the International Water Management Institute. I wondered, okay, the debate sounds a bit clunky, right? It's about women and land. I mean, come on, we have to unpack this a little bit. Surely we have to also consider other resources in relation to land, water being one very important resource for productive purposes. But secondly, which women are we talking about here? You know, is it as simple a category as women and land, or are we talking about, you know, the nuances, the differences, the hierarchies within communities? I'd like the panel to reflect on some of these kind of nuanced issues, you know, the bigger picture. It's not just about these two very simple categories that we've been around. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Let's take one more question because our time's going to get squeezed if we're not careful. Women here at the front.
Thank you. Anna Locke from ODI. From what I'm gathering for the main arguments here, there's the about women's land rights, it's the moral one about equal rights, it's the economic one about incentives for investment, and the social one about influence over expenditure and how that can lead to better outcomes. What I'm getting less strongly is the link to the environmental outcome. And I suppose what I found really interesting was this discussion about if we did transform power relationships and women had access to equal rights as we all would like to have it, would that actually then transform women's relationship with land? So can we assume that women are sort of guardians of conservation, or are there things that we need to also be thinking very carefully about in that transition? I'm just
Okay.
like, yeah.
No, I hear you. Thank you. Ruth, do you want to have a crack at responding to both of those, really? What women are we talking about? There are hierarchies there too. And then I think it's actually the same question I've been rattling away. What are actually the implications to the environment?
So we did two parts on that. One is we did a review, and I'm happy to provide it. It's in the annual review of environment and resources on gender and sustainability. We were commissioned to say, and we looked at the literature. And while there is a strong ecofeminist literature that says women are the keepers of the earth, the empirical basis is a lot more mixed. In many cases, women are wanting income for their families and say, we'll migrate once the resources are depleted. Complex stuff, to Alan's point about water. I mean, we're doing work on groundwater in India, where women are slightly significantly more likely to mine the groundwater when they're given the choice because they want the income. So women do want incomes for their families as well. However, in terms of the environmental side of this and the other resources, like Andrea's point on Ghana, I really liked that example because I've had that same kind of an experience in Cambodia when we were looking at the potential for a development project, and we did resource mapping with the men and the women, and the man from the Ministry of blank said, well, we don't actually need to do this exercise with the women because they really don't know a lot about this. And it was sort of okay, just humor me, let's do, let's have the men and the women do their resource mapping. Men were done in 15 minutes. They had, nice big boundaries. The women at 45 minutes were still going at it with lots of detailed resources. And Diane Rochelot has done a lot of work on this about women using the interstitial spaces, she calls it, the in-between spaces where there are lots of wild vegetables or leafy greens that are high in nutrition, or medicinal plants, resources that are often overlooked, that Inger, I'm sure, will tell us are really critical for biodiversity. They provide very important environmental functions. And giving women decision-making power over that, as well as, Alan, yes, absolutely, on water. These are very, very important in there. Actually, livestock too, because the way you manage livestock has really important landscape level environmental functions. So yes, you can't look only at one resource, but land, including not just the private land. I'm really glad you brought in the public land. I hadn't thought about some of those things, but because yesterday we had a session on community and indigenous land rights. Common property is really important, and that women have voice in how the commons are managed, and that the commons are recognized, because that is also very important.
And that is very much about societal change, all those other things. It's not something you can change at the land ministry or whoever's.
No, but it's partly a matter of valorizing these other kinds of outputs, so that we don't just measure the productivity of the land in terms of marketed cash values, but some of these other, maybe small volume but high value, like the medicinal plants. Once the medicinal plants are harvested and shipped to Germany and sold in an Ayurvedic store there, they're suddenly very high value, but when they're actually, consumed by people in the household who are sick in the poor country, it just goes totally under the radar.
That's interesting. So do you think that the communities in which these women live are undervaluing what they do? So if you show the local leaders, who are probably men, that they have undervalued what women contribute, you may get a better result.
We are getting that. We are showing that result in Burkina Faso, where a Helen Keller project has been building community gardens, that when they realized, the men were realizing the value of the garden produce that women were doing, it suddenly became more over time became more acceptable for women to have control rights over land. And I think that's Esther is probably can tell us more.
Yeah, I like the question of which women we are talking about. Definitely women are homogeneous. They are rich women. We come from different races. We come from different ethnic groups. We have different access. So we talk about different kinds of women. But basically, when it comes actually to issues of land rights, it does not matter which, at least in my country. In my country now, the record is less than 5% have access and control of land. If titling is what to show access to land, only less than 5% of women have land in their names, titled in their names. And we are over 50%, over 50% of the women, of the population are women. Meaning it's not only the very ones I work with, the ones who are living in poverty, it is also across the board. Even the middle class and actually very well-to-do women, access to land is still a difficult thing. When we organized community land watchdog groups, which we thought we were only supporting the very women who are living in poverty, we were shocked to get professional women who came to ask the watchdog groups to support. And the only difference between the ones that we were supporting who lived in poverty and these rich ones is the rich ones could pay for their legal processes, could actually facilitate. But the very ones who are living in poverty, they could not provide services to get the documentation. That was the only difference. But when it comes to land rights, really all the women get to suffer. The other thing,
I suppose the biggest landowner in Kenya may be a woman.
no, actually the proof is they're not the biggest landowners.
Well, she's put
but
lots
they
of that
are-
land in different cousins' names.
Well, let's not go that way. I will not agree to go that way. But I think we have many men who have big chunks of land. We have very few women, and that's not what we're saying. We're saying across the board we need equality, access and equality. And I think one of the things when it comes to climate change, issues of conservation, we've lost it, and we've not lost it because we do not have new technologies to deal with it. It's also because we are not using indigenous knowledge for one group of the category of the community. We've not used women. We just got some grants to work in northern Kenya because Kenya now has a default form of governance. And what we are checking, are the government mainstreaming climate change policies in what we are calling the county integrated development plans, which are very new. And when USAID gave us this grant, we insisted we want to have it a community-led approach. And we insisted as an organization that works with grassroots women, we want grassroots women to be at the center stage. The counties of Marsabit and Isiolo are actually shocked by the amount of knowledge that was not known, because we help the women to actually surface all the practical experiences they have had for conservation. We went in one of the parts where there's a desert, where women have actually rehabilitated and protected, and there is water flowing, and there are big amount of tree area that they have actually planted for the last 20 years, and the people had not used their knowledge. So now the county government is willing to use that knowledge of what the women are doing. So I think by giving women access to land rights, you are also drawing from the knowledge of the experience they have to conserve.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask where our cards have got to? Are you ready with your selection? Why don't we hear what you, the audience, have got to say about the one biggest issue in terms of unpicking this problem, and then we'll get back to the panel.
Well, I can summarize actually two important issues, and there was several underlining about awareness and sensibilization that has to be addressed not only to women in order to let them aware about their rights, but also to men and also to all those who belongs to the leadership. And another point was involving into the market, since anyway they're already part of the market. For example, let's think about non-wood forest products. It's really important to involve them also in the development and all the structure of the market of the products.
And what was the most surprising thing that you read?
Well, the market actually was just one comment, but it was interesting in my opinion. And then about awareness, it's something that is really important in my opinion also, that men has to be involved in the practical part. So in my opinion it was not surprising, but anyway, I was positively surprised. I was happy about listening to this.
The men.
The fact that men should be involved in a pragmatical way in securing women rights and women participation in land integrity.
Okay, need to get the men on board.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, Ingrid, do you want to chip in now?
Well, just a couple of thoughts, because this is really interesting in an effort to unclunk what has been characterized as a clunky debate, which I don't know that I would have characterized it as such, but there we are. I think that we are looking at, we're not talking about a utopian situation and if only rights were granted and we wave the magic wand and all is well and fine. Nobody's pretending that. So that's just, has to be clear. There's some fundamentals which we dealt with in the first part that everyone agrees has to get done, clear. So imagine that those fundamentals, what's a counterfactual then? That's what a couple of questions were. So now we have this magic understanding that societies are stratified, all this ABC stuff that I think we all understand. Nevertheless, then the question is, would the world be different? Well, hey, I can't answer that. But I can say that what we have so far hasn't worked particularly well, hasn't optimized agricultural productivity, hasn't dealt with malnutrition, hasn't optimized water usage, etc., etc. And so the situation around conservation, women as the conservation activists on the ground, I think it's very real. And one that we see from International Union of Conservation often, because women are often those that farm the margins. Women are often those that take care of those places where the pollinators multiply. Basic pollinator service that you need for everything and anything, but they are on the fences where the wildflowers are, etc., etc. Not the things necessarily that large-scale agriculture, industrial agriculture care for, and yet is absolutely critical. We are, by the way, seeing in some parts of the world the disappearance of pollinators, and pollination then having been to be done either by hand or by mechanical means, and the cost is astronomical. So taking care of those things while we do the other stuff becomes important. And the last point would be around just giving you, since you're looking for examples and thinking around this, and I'm trying to put it in context, we're here at COP21. So we have seen massive cutting down of mangroves because people are poor, they cut them down, etc. And we've seen, especially in Southeast Asia, developments right to the seashore. IUCN have been working with re-establishing of mangroves in a program called Mangroves for the Future. And many times it's the women that take this on because it's not particularly income driven, etc. And so women are willing to protect their homes by re-establishing mangroves. But what we see, the moment you establish mangroves, women say, well, now we can create crayfish banks. So you start, but I borrow some crayfish from you, and I start my own, and then I blend on, and this whole, so then there's a sideline of income that also enhances nutrition and enhances, obviously, household well-being. So the point here is that the nature-based solutions, some of these solutions, without being naive and without being utopian, are very real. And oftentimes...
Why is that true of women, but it wouldn't be true of men?
Because men are often engaged less closely to the immediate nutritional needs of the families. And so men are often engaged, right or wrong, good or bad, I'm not passing judgment, in a cash-based economy. And so forest products, women derive, forest-based women derive more than 50% of their income from forests, men around 30. Why is that? It's not because women are better and men are worse. Men are also outselling their labor and their muscle. It's just that there are different differentiation, and so it's not a clunky discussion. It is a stratified situation, but we need to understand by empowering women, they will come up with these ingenious things that the rest of us couldn't have thought of that will enhance income for the family.
Thank you very much. We're going to end in just a few minutes with, I'm going to ask you, the panel, the same question that the audience has asked. And I'm going to expect you all to come up with a snappy answer. It's complicated, it's a complicated world, but if there's one thing that you would address head on or unpick, what would it be? But just before we get there, can we just do a little bit more to characterize the nature of the effort as it exists? Inga suggested that we're not being terribly successful. Yeah, you're going to have that opportunity. What by and large is the nature of the effort to push planting rights for women? And really have a track at this too.
So I think one of the important frameworks we haven't talked about is the SDGs, so the global goals that were agreed back in September, and property rights and land rights are within those. And there is a new global donor panel that's trying to work through what the indicators might be for that and how we actually measure that, in particular with the gender lens. And that's really important. We're chairing that to start with, but it's really important because if you can't measure it, and there's a valuing of the measuring, and then there's an incentive set to actually program in that area and to start driving the change, and then you start to be able to tell the stories that you're asking for about the kind of causal chain about what happens then what happens next. So there's the kind of the SDG point, but there's also a kind of private sector point.
Sorry, can you characterize the nature of our efforts? Is it mostly large scale, small scale, regional, national?
Whose efforts? Globally?
yeah, these things go in fashion. What do you see as being the main nature of efforts to push?
Well, I mean,
Rights of women.
there's a big global effort now with the SDGs set a whole new global framework in which we're trying to embed land rights within that.
So much more political attention at the global level.
It's much more political attention. Part of it came out of the G8 back in a couple of years ago when the UK were chairing. It's come through the G7 this year and it'll carry on through the G7 next year. There's a huge push there on kind of transparency and accountability around land rights. The second one, though, is the big driver around the private sector who are investing in many poor countries. And they're investing, and one of their main concerns is around water scarcity in particular. Is a huge concern for them because, particularly whether you're Coca-Cola, your Pepsi, or Saab Miller, essentially you need access to water resources, you need to manage it properly, and you also know that that's where your potential point of conflict is with the local communities. So you have an incredible driver and incentive to think about whose land are you in, who owns it, to document and clarify those kind of the land rights issues, and also then to think about the management of the water resources in particular within it. So there's an incentive set for the private sector side, both, and that's an economic.
We know that such companies are really worried about water, and they're also worried about the political risk of going into more stressed areas where ownership is unclear. Are there any examples where governments are responding to that anxiety? In other words, trying to straighten out their land title, including the rights that they recognise for women as a result of that investor pressure? Or is that something that you're predicting will come?
No, I mean, at Davos last year at the World Economic Forum, it was identified as a number one global risk on the private sector for water. So clearly through Davos and through the kind of political engagement there at a leader level, there's a recognition that if you want to attract private sector investment into a country and you want to stimulate that, you're going to have to address some of the issues that the private sector are most concerned with, which is around kind of access to
Ruth, got I think 2 minutes.
Sure. I think our emphasis, we're coming around to the idea of gender and assets being a focal point for all kinds of development. That the ability to engage in most types of development, especially sustainable, depends on assets. Land is one of them. We're sort of doing the tenure plus. Other assets are also important along with this. But what we have come to is, rather than treating it as separate men's versus women's assets, we're really pushing for looking at jointness of assets, strengthening women's rights within marriage and inheritance, so family law in that, as well as land law, but also not trying to make it a zero-sum game, recognizing the importance of working jointly within the household, and also jointness of assets at the community level, and strengthening that and women's voices within that, because a lot of the resources that women really depend on go beyond the limited household or farm boundaries. As a very short summary.
Well, I think that's an excellent answer. We've got 3 minutes left. So you've got a bit less than a minute each to say what is the one big thing that you would press if it was the only button you could press. Same question that the audience answered. Andrea, do you want to start with that? And then we'll just go down the line.
I think measurement and data and analysis is the heart of it. Actually, if you can't measure, you're not doing typing, you're not kind of doing it, walking around, which they did in Rwanda. The basis of Rwanda's program was going around and literally walking the fields and demarcating and making new maps. If you don't have that titling, it's the heart of all our forestry work. If you don't have that, you're not on a solid foundation to start with.
Okay, thank you for that. Inga?
Just very briefly, we're living in a time of crisis. Everyone knows that. That's why we have COP21. We need to think of nature as an ally in resolving that crisis, and women as enabled actors with the agency to help making that happen. These are the two things. Work with nature, work with women. You can't do it without either.
Right. Okay, so it's an approach rather than a particular policy. Yeah. Joanne?
Yeah, it's action, because we have the commitments already, and I like the data one, so I'm going to talk about that. But I think what we are looking for us to get to 2025, 30% allocation of women, of land. It's for women. It's not easy. So we are looking for governments to actually commit to no programs that touch on land, unless it is in areas where there is a commitment and a move towards that 30% allocation. Any new program that is going and being rolled out right now, we are looking to say, the government will say, well, show me how you're going to achieve that 30%. Or it needs to be based, and we are calling on development partners to do the same. So that if you are rolling out a program somewhere, if you don't see that 30% allocation or a move towards that by the end of the program, we are saying, please don't go there, it's not going to work.
So holding government to commitments that they've already
And
made.
our development partners. Thank you.
Okay. Esther.
And I think for me is that it's clear, and I've been here for a week and a half, and what I was doing is facilitating the 2015 UNDP Equator Initiative Award winners to share experiences. And what for me is very important is the amount of knowledge that communities have to sustain their livelihood and to protect environment. And what would be very important is actually to invest in understanding what are the community innovative practices to access land. What are community innovative practices to sustainably conserve natural resources and scale that? That I think it's necessary. In terms of data, I think what the missing gap, data is very important. The missing gap is who collects data, who analyzes this data, and who keeps this data. And I think it's so important that women, particularly those who are living in the situations which we want to address, becomes part and parcel of collecting data, of analyzing data, and keeping this data. Because only then can they be able to influence policies with every government that comes every 5 years or every 4 years.
So broader empowerment of women, including in the institutions of the state.
Yes, but also having very formalized and practical relationships with researchers, with donors, where they are predictable relationship. It's not just going there and asking women to give data, and then this data is never in their hands, they cannot influence. It's really having predictable and effective way of working with women so that they can be part of collecting the data, analyzing this data, and keeping it.
Thank you very much for that. Ruth, you have a final word.
Oh, boy. Well, I love it that everybody's stressing data as a researcher, and I like your point about the partnerships on the data. So I don't, but I think the implementation side of it, in terms of legal literacy, community-based legal assistance, this kind of engagement is also going to be part and parcel for seeing through any kinds of reforms. So I like the whole global to local spread we've had here.
And if there's one thing that you would push above all others?
I guess the legal, not just the legal literacy, but the community dialogues that ultimately change the norms that are required for it. Because state law is only one part of what gives property rights. Customary norms, which are living things and do change over time, has to be a part of it to make the legitimacy to go along with the legality that Joanne mentioned.
So taking account of local opinion.
And perhaps maybe a little shaping of local, or giving women space to shape that local opinion.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, will you join with me in thanking our